This is my one.
These children from Lewisham Primary School in Sydney are designing their own playground.
At the car.
They've been working on the design for 9 months with Tex Scewthorpe, a local Aboriginal artist, and with others within the school community. The children's ideas now form part of a landscaping master plan. The plan incorporates Aboriginal themes. The playground is called Lewisham Meeting Place on Cadigal land, Cadigal being the Aboriginal name for the area. This multicultural school weaves many activities into its curriculum to support reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The aim is to bring people and their environment together in harmony and to build a positive future. The Sea of Hands mural on the playground wall is part of this future. It's a simple and heartfelt expression of unity and reconciliation. As part of a national community project, the children went on to create cardboard hands. Each hand was signed. The hands then formed part of a huge display that covered the lawns of Federal Parliament in the national capital. This giant montage was a show of support by ordinary Australians for reconciliation and native title rights for Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. It was a clear call for positive solutions and a rejection of the politics of division, hatred and ignorance. Bishop Arthur Malcolm.
If we want to build a hopeful future, a reconciled future for ourselves and for our children, then all of us need to show our hand in support. It's not going to happen any other way.
On that day in Canberra, when the Sea of Hands covered the lawns, 2 women appeared together. The following day, their faces were seen in newspapers across the country. In their own quiet way, they had moved beyond words with a simple embrace. It was Gladys Tibingumpa, representing the Wik people, who had danced in front of the High Court of Australia when it announced its historic Wik decision. In response to Wik, it was Camilla Cowley, a grazier from Queensland, who had voluntarily negotiated with the local Gungari people to recognise their native title rights to her property. It's Camilla's story that we now present, a story made complete by this woman, Ethel Munn. Their story centres around North Yanco, a 9,000 hectare property in southwest Queensland. Camilla and Kerry Carley purchased the pastoral lease on this property 20 years ago. Camilla explains.
We'd come out of the bad 90s drought with a huge debt, and we'd managed to get on top of it again. Things finally seemed to be going okay. I mean, the wool prices were terrible, but we didn't have a debt. We owned, finally, clearly, our own little piece of dirt. You know, we had really grown to love every acre of it.
Ethel loves this land too. Like Camilla, she's a grazier, wife and mother. As one of the Gungari people, she's also a traditional owner in this area.
It does feel like my land. I would like to come back here and walk here and do all sorts of things here. You're part of it. It's a bit uncanny, I suppose, for you white fellas. I don't know, but it's, you know, it is. It's just that amazing feeling. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Camilla's life changed one day when she received an envelope. Within it was a native title claim by the Gungari people over the Yanco property. This claim followed the High Court Wik ruling. The ruling stated that native title rights could coexist with pastoral land rights. Traditional Indigenous owners were to have access to the land.
It was thoroughly read and reread just to make sure there wasn't any mistake. It really was us, and it really was someone we'd never heard of. The words on that form, they frightened me. I mean, the words, you couldn't get past the words. And I think people still can't get past the words. Occupation, possession, use of and enjoyment to wander over as they have for thousands of years. You know, those words, you put those words in our context, and that means there's no place left for you here. That you are being, this is ironic, dispossessed of your land. I really was determined that I was going to find a Gungri and I was going to talk to them face to face.
That happened soon after, when Camilla attended an angry native title protest meeting held by the pastoralists at the Mitchell Shire Hall. Ethel was the only Indigenous grazier at the meeting and courageously stood up and spoke her mind. Ethel's stand impressed Camilla. They met and talked after the meeting.
Then there was the first clear and precise explanation of exactly what their claim meant. When they told me exactly what they hoped to get out of it, which was, first of all, recognition, which was access to places of significance. And why? Because they wanted to get back in touch with something that had been taken from them, not through their choice. And that their ability to do that needn't affect my ability to run my property at all.
The Carleys and the Munns swapped addresses and phone numbers. Soon after, Ethel and her husband Gordon stayed with the Carleys at Yanco.
It was around her table, and there were just the Munns and the Carleys that talked about everything and anything.
And that is when I learned the history. That's when I learned that both their families had been touched by the stolen generation. That's when I learned of them being gathered up and put in reserves. That's when I learned about their treatment on the reserves.
And we're not really these horrible grasping people that wanted to come in and take everything of yours and everybody else's and leave you with nothing, sort of thing.
I was so angry with myself that I had been unaware that this was the history of this country. I was angry that I had gone on for so long, completely oblivious to the pain, to the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of recognition, the lack of any sort of equality of voice. That hadn't occurred to me before.
Over time, with her family's agreement and Ethel's support, Camilla set about drawing up a document believed to be the first of its kind in Australia. It was a voluntary native title agreement between the Carleys and the Gungari people, providing access to North Yanco. It conformed to all the principles of the Wick decision. It was a binding covenant written into the land title to continue in perpetuity.
I would love to think that in 30 years' time, here at Yanco, my children and their children, and Ethel's grandchildren and their children are celebrating that 30 years ago, Australia finally owned up to its past and went in a different direction. I would love to think that that could happen.
Camilla's decision cost her friendships and support within her local community.
The worst thing that happened to her was being cut dead in church, not giving her the sign of peace. When Camilla turned to give her the greeting of the peace, she just turned away and cut her completely dead. That really did hit home, I think, to Camilla, that things weren't going to be easy, but she's learning. She's learning. But I just wish I could have saved her, though.
They knew, and they tried to protect me from it. I mean, after everything that white Australia had done to them in their lives, they were trying to protect a white Australia. After all that, they could be so forgiving as to want to protect me from myself.
The history of White Australia's treatment of Indigenous Australians needs to be outlined here briefly. The intention is not to be negative, but rather to present the facts honestly and to emphasise the importance and value of Camilla and Ethel's story. European settlement began in the late 18th century with the establishment of British penal colonies. As the colonist numbers grew, so did their desire for land. Despite the established presence of Indigenous nations across the continent as shown on this map, with some of these communities dating back 40,000 years before Christ, the British had declared Australia terra nullius, an uninhabited land. This policy suited the settlers. They took land as they needed it. Indigenous communities were forced from the best land. With superior arms, white settlers continued to expand, bringing not only themselves, but European diseases which took an additional heavy toll. For more than 150 years, an undeclared land war was waged between black and white communities. By the 1920s, the war was over, and the remaining Indigenous communities were either forcibly taken to government reserves or, with nowhere else to go, went to church missions. Up until the 1960s, official government policy saw many Aboriginal children taken from their parents and placed either in white foster homes or in institutions. This period is known as the Stolen Generation and is the subject of a recent national inquiry. Aboriginal Australians have requested a formal apology from the federal government. The present government refuses to apologise. But not all developments have been negative. In 1967, the Australian people overwhelmingly passed a referendum which saw Indigenous peoples counted as Australians for the first time. While White Australia patted itself on the back for this late recognition, the impact of the referendum was limited. Its effect was to make Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders Australian citizens and subjects of the Crown. It did not recognise that Australia was inhabited at the time of European settlement. It did not recognise today's Indigenous Australians as descendants of the original inhabitants. Nor did it address their native title rights. This came 25 years later with the Mabo ruling by the High Court in 1992. The court upheld Eddie Mabo's claim that Murray Islanders held native title to 3 small islands in the Torres Strait. This judgment laid to rest once and for all the legal fiction that Australia was an empty land when Europeans arrived. But there remains the issue of pastoral leases. A pastoral lease is a land title. Such titles were first issued to European settlers in the 19th century. Settlers could run stock or farm crops, but were to allow Indigenous communities continual access to the land. They were to coexist. In 1996, the High Court upheld this traditional understanding. The Wik people's native title coexisted with pastoral leases. The anger and fear that Camilla Carley experienced because of the Wik ruling are the same emotions that many other pastoral lease holders carry today. The speakers at the native title protest meeting that Camilla and Ethel attended played on these emotions.
The speakers left us with the feeling that we really had to have native title extinguished because everything would be stalled, production would be stalled, you'd never be able to go any further, nobody knew what could possibly happen, and after listening to the various speakers, that was my opinion too.
Amid the sea of hands, Camilla added,
And I can see that what our producer organisations are peddling is a load of, mistruths. It simply isn't true. Now, they can't be that silly, so where's it coming from? You tell me.
There's been a message of hatred from vested interests who are ready to mow down people like Camilla and to mow down anybody who takes a stand for native title. Wik has been a very bitter national debate in our country, but we don't further reconciliation by backing away from that debate. And we don't further ourselves as believers, as Christians, by giving way to hatred. We will continue to stand up for native title.
Many Australians have expressed their sorrow for past wrongs. The churches have offered their apologies, as have state governments. On National Sorry Day, thousands of Australians, young and old, in cities and regional centres signed their names in sorry books. These were then presented to traditional owners. The ceremonies were often very moving. The Aboriginal and Islander Commission and the National Council of Churches in Australia support these efforts, working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike to further reconciliation. The response of ordinary Australians at the grassroots has often taken on its own momentum. Indigenous leaders have recognised this movement.
But optimism springs eternal, and I have faith in the Australian people. Reconciliation belongs to the people. It is a people's movement. What we do in our time will be the inheritance of our children and grandchildren. We're shaping and moulding our image in the community of nations, our place in the world, our sense of place. We are defining our common identity as Australians and the terms and conditions to share this country.
It's that common identity that many Australians are now working towards. People like Ethel and Camilla and the community at Lewisham Primary School are exploring what it is to be Australians together. In their own way, they have moved beyond words and are creating their new future.